Hello, everyone. Welcome to Pawan Luthra podcast. With social cohesion and multicultural issues so much in the headlines these days, we are indeed fortunate to have with us Julian Hill, Assistant Minister for Multicultural Affairs and Citizenship, joining us today. Welcome, Julian.
Great to be with you.
Your electorate of Bruce has the second highest diverse population in Australia. You are now the Assistant Minister for Multicultural Affairs. A natural fit?
It's an incredible slice of Melbourne with people from literally all over the world. And when the Prime Minister unexpectedly offered me this job mid last year, I thought how amazing the chance to work now with communities right across Australia. So much of it is similar, but there's also differences, of course, if you take the time to listen and get out there, as I've been trying to do right around the country in regional areas, in every capital city, and actually listen and talk to people about their experiences in Australia.
And what have you heard?
Incredible diversity of stuff. In the big cities, actually, like Sydney, where we are today, or my home city of Melbourne, sort of to some degree Brisbane, because there's critical mass in communities often, there's not always as much mixing between communities. So what I have observed, which was lovely, is in regional centres, in smaller capital cities, there's actually a lot more intercultural stuff that goes on because the communities kind of work together more.
It's been 50 years since Gough Whitlam declared this as a multicultural nation. If you had to give a report card to the former Prime Minister 50 years on, what are the things which you believe have worked well and which are some which we need to work more on?
As a general comment, I think we should be proud. 50 years on, looking back, we are a diverse country, we're a wealthier country, we're a country that's globally connected with the region and in every continent in the world. I think that stood us in good stead with our economic development, with our trading relationships and with our foreign relationships. We now have a foreign minister of our country, Senator Penny Wong, who has Malaysian, Chinese heritage, and that's a good thing because it shows the face of Australia. When you travel around the world, too often people from other countries think, all Australians were white because that's what our politicians and leaders were. Well, that is changing and that's a good thing. We do see in the last few years social cohesion is under strain. And being a globally connected society, it does mean that events overseas impact daily life here for good and for bad. I think the impact of social media, which has atomised society, your listeners would know that it's sometimes too easy to just unfriend, to block, to unsubscribe, to follow and create an echo chamber where you only encounter people who share your view. And so one thing I have observed is we need to work harder to make sure that Australians are connecting with people who are different and that we encounter views that are different and need to rediscover the art of disagreeing agreeably when we don't agree on things.
Reasonable pluralism is a permanent feature of a democratic society. We do not need to agree on all issues, though division is often amplified. With growing divisions, how can we find common ground?
The magic ingredient to me is leadership. So you need the legal foundations, you need investments, and government does make investments, often in helping people new here to set up and be able to build their life. But the magic ingredient for a successful multicultural country is leadership.
But are we getting it on the political area? You mentioned about the RDA, the Racial Discrimination Act, when they had to elect the first ethnic communities council chairperson, Al Grassby. There was a town hall meeting in Sydney, and we had both Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser, and they both had a unified decision to actually appoint Mr. Grassby. Can we see that happening these days?
I'm disappointed with the behaviour, frankly, of both extremes of Australian politics. It hasn't been an easy time to govern with social cohesion under strain. You've got the Greens political party that has sought to weaponise the conflict over Gaza, spreading at times disinformation and misinformation. And unfortunately, you've got the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, one of the most divisive conservative people in modern Australian history, who has a career over 20 years of stoking division and seeking to divide people rather than bringing them together. At times that's been a successful political tactic for him, but sadly I do observe that I think there has been a degradation, not a complete loss, but a degradation in bipartisanship around our social cohesion and a willingness, unfortunately, from the opposition leader to weaponise those divisions. We've seen that and we've said that previously in relation to the conflict in Gaza, but there have been other examples. I would have liked him to stand with the Prime Minister to combat anti-Semitism, to stand with the Prime Minister to combat Islamophobia and other forms of racism and discrimination, instead of yelling and screaming and, frankly, behaving beneath the dignity of his office. I would I know from talking to Liberal friends at times, they're not all comfortable with how that behaviour is played out. But listen to if you don't believe politicians, listen to the Director General of Security, the head of ASIO, who's called repeatedly for leaders to lower the temperature, to rediscover that art of civil discourse and disagreeing agreeably.
How do you think media has played a part in this weaponization?
I'll choose my answer carefully. One thing that I would observe with the rise of social media and digitalisation is that the algorithms and unfortunately some of the media editorial increasingly is chasing clicks and eyeballs. And one of the fastest way to get clicks and eyeballs is to spread outrage and anger. And there are media outlets in this country, so-called mainstream ones as well as fringe ones, that seem to have gone down the rabbit hole of seeking clicks and outrage. I'll quote myself for a moment, because I've already said this in public. I have called out the Australian newspaper on television last week for this pattern of behaviour where they go through the history of a Muslim organisation and they look for a former employee or a current employee or a volunteer or someone who's been on the board and then search their social media and find something offensive and then put it on page one and say the government has to cancel their grants. If the Liberal Party want an excuse, the Liberal Party is feeding this stuff to them. It's a co-produced campaign. Everyone knows it is. It's about time we called that kind of behaviour out and said, well, if you just want to cancel the family violence grants or the youth grants or the housing grants, then just say so. Because that's a standard which no other organisation in the country could be held to. All your listeners know down the footy club, there's always some idiot in the corner who says some racist or sexist stuff. What, we're going to cancel all the sporting grants because of that? There's always someone who holds offensive views in a business down the corner. We're going to cancel all the manufacturing grants. This is an example of a pattern of behaviour from parts of the media who should know better, that are running a political campaign against the government and harming our social cohesion in the process.
Now, identity politics seems to be on the rise. Should it be embraced or avoided?
I am concerned that identity politics has gone way too far. And, I'm a proud Labor MP. The core purpose of the Labor Party, when you strip it back, was socio-economic justice. That means economic justice, a fairer society, making sure that the poorest kids who are smart can have a good education, your Medicare card, not your credit card, gives you access to healthcare, and social equality. What we talked about, the Racial Discrimination Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, the Age Discrimination Act, that people get treated fairly. So I think that's good, but we can't see everything through the prism of someone's identity. There are also things that we have in common. And I do think that part of the left of politics would be well served to getting back to that social embrace people's cultural traditions, their ancestral traditions, their languages, their faiths. But the real magic happens, not just when we cherish that, but when we share these things with our neighbours. And some on the conservative side have sort of tried to use intercultural as a way of getting away from multicultural. That's not what I'm saying. But a lot of the magic happens as Australians when we don't just have Diwali, we invite our neighbours in to join the fun. Eid is fantastic. Muslim Australians get 2 Eids. Yes. My Muslim mates say it's a bit like Christmas, but we get 2. And some of the funnest Eids I've been to are the neighbourhood parties where they invite all the neighbours in. You got people from 10 different nationalities doing Eid together. There's lots of opportunities most weekends, if you search them out, to go and experience different cultures in our suburbs and regions and cities. That's a great thing.
But while staying there on the migration strategy, how does the government's migration policy balance economic needs with population growth concerns?
Migration is a fascinating policy area because it is balancing social issues, economic issues, as well as capacity issues in the country. That's the core of migration, as well as national security. But I do think the previous government over-securitized everything in that space. Migration, sure, you've got to make sure people are safe when they come to the country and do the security checks, but it's a social and economic policy area. What we inherited from the former government, frankly, under Dutton and Morrison and the whole rotten cabal, was a broken migration system with no real policy and strategy in the national interest.
Mm.
Our migration policy settings will and should change from year to year depending on the economy and the national interest.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we have an ageing population in Australia. To give you a fact, this often helps put it in context. Only a few decades ago, we used to have 9 or 10 workers paying tax for every retiree. We're now down to about 3.5. You can't run a country on that. So the only reason the country works is because of superannuation Labor put in, and because we have a good skilled migration program to bring in areas of skill shortage. We dial that up or down depending on the economic circumstances, and at the moment we're trying to reduce net overseas migration given some of the housing pressures. But a lot of the numbers that are bandied around in the newspaper are nonsense.
India produces a large number of skilled professionals. How can Australia better leverage this talent pool?
Well, I think around 1 million Indians turn 18 every month. They're numbers that boggle Australia's mind. India is the fastest growing group of migrants to Australia,
yes.
and overwhelmingly are entrepreneurial, come with skills, and make great Australians. Now, I couldn't imagine our country now without the contribution of Indian Australians, and we welcome international students from India, very bright young people, many of whom choose to stay, not all of whom do or can.
Mainstream media landscape in Australia, 78% of the reporters are from Anglo-Celtic backgrounds and do not hold a mirror to the society which we live in. Your thoughts on this and how can this be changed?
I gave a speech late last year, which is on my website and around, which is, I actually wrote most of it myself. It's a thoughtful speech at the Media Diversity Roundtable about this topic. Our institutions of power in our society should reflect the community. And as I said, our side of politics is getting better. The Conservatives have a long way to go. Some days it looks like the same man in the same blue suit when you look across. But the military has a way to go, but they're starting to bring people through. The public service in parts is getting better. The judiciary has a long way to go. So if you look at the institutions of power, the media has to sit alongside that. The stories we tell, the people that we see telling them, goes very much to whether people feel included and have a stake in our country. When you turn on the TV, you want it to look like the country. Now, it still doesn't, but there has been progress made. I'd point out to all news organisations that SBS is the world's most multilingual broadcaster in 60 languages, and it's Australia's most trusted. So yeah, we have a way to go. There's a mix of mentoring programs, of measurement, and so on. But, I was really pleased that at the level of engagement from the media executives and those who lead the media and the commitment to mentoring and fostering diverse talent and bringing it through, because there's some terrific people. But it's one of the reasons I also do to try to make time in an incredibly busy diary to sit down with leaders and actually serious journalists such as yourself and have a chat.
Now, given it's an election year, what upcoming reforms in citizenship and multicultural affairs should the communities be aware of?
Well, you're not going to be surprised, and I'm not going to start making election announcements randomly, but I'd make a couple of points. On citizenship, we do have a difference. We do have a contrast. The government believes that the current settings, 4 years in Australia, pass a citizenship test in basic English, confirm your commitment to our country with the pledge of commitment, pass the security checks, is good. We think that's right. We're committed to that. On the other hand, you have Peter Dutton and the Liberal Party, who has a consistent pattern over years or his decades in public life of putting up proposals to make it harder to become Australian. When he was the Home Affairs Minister, he tried to introduce a university-level English language test to become an Australian. Frankly, a test that many Australians born here would never pass, and I'm quite sure quite a few people in his party room would never pass from listening to them talk. That's snobbery. You don't have to have gone to university and have perfect English to be a good Australian. But he's already still floating proposals to make it harder to become Australian, and only in the last couple of weeks, he's been hysterical, running around the country complaining that Labor's facilitating citizenship ceremonies. People follow the law. They met the requirements. We should celebrate them taking their commitment to Australia. And frankly, it's people from India that are the largest group in those ceremonies. If the Liberal Party don't want people from India to become citizens, then they should just say so instead of this confected outrage. I'll stand by our record of a commitment to a fair Australia where everyone gets a fair crack at life over that mob any day.
What a lovely way to circle back. Julian Hill, Assistant Minister for Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs, thank you for joining us on Pawan Luthra podcast.
Thanks for having me.